Don't worry, someone had said earlier that night with a careless laugh. People like her don't even notice what's going on. The words still lingered in the air long after the guests had left, echoing faintly against the marble floors of the restaurant as the last of the lights dimmed to a soft amber glow, and Ava Johnson stood alone with a mop in her hands, moving slowly across the polished surface like a shadow no one had bothered to name, her sneakers whispering against the floor, her reflection stretching and bending beneath her, as if even the ground couldn't decide whether she was worth remembering. And for a moment, the world felt quiet in that particular way it only does after midnight, when the noise of money and power finally fades, and all that remains are the people who clean up after it, the ones who are never invited to the table, but always expected to restore it. And Ava worked with a rhythm that came from years of doing this exact thing, steady, precise, invisible, her eyes lowered not out of weakness but habit, because eye contact in places like this often came with consequences she had learned to avoid. And yet there was something different about the silence tonight, something heavier, as if the room itself was holding its breath, watching without revealing its eyes, while just beyond the edge of the dining area, concealed behind a darkened column near the private lounge, William Carter stood perfectly still, his tailored suit now just another shape in the shadows, his presence erased by intention rather than oversight. Because tonight he wasn't here to be seen, he was here to observe, to understand what happened when no one thought they were being watched, when titles disappeared and performance fell away, and he had expected boredom, routine, maybe a few careless mistakes, but not this, not the way Ava paused mid-step when she noticed a crumpled bill tucked beneath a chair leg, not the way she picked it up and glanced around instinctively before smoothing it out and placing it carefully beside the register instead of slipping it into her pocket, not the quiet note she scribbled on a receipt and left for the morning shift. Customer at table 12 allergic to almonds. Please double check. As if the responsibility of care extended beyond her shift, beyond her pay, beyond what anyone would ever thank her for. And William's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in something closer to curiosity, because this wasn't performance. There was no audience here, no manager watching, no incentive except the kind that doesn't show up on a paycheck. And Ava exhaled softly, rolling her shoulders before setting the mop aside, her movements unguarded now, unaware of the gaze fixed on her from the dark. And she reached into her worn canvas bag, pulling out a small, scuffed laptop that looked like it had seen better days, placing it gently on a nearby table as if it mattered more than anything else in the room. And when she opened it, the glow from the screen lit her face just enough to reveal a focus that didn't belong to someone who was supposed to be just cleaning, her fingers moving quickly, confidently, navigating through lines of data and spreadsheets with the kind of precision that didn't come from guessing. And somewhere in the stillness, William Carter stopped being a man who owned the room and became a man who was trying to understand it, because the woman he thought he had already defined was quietly rewriting that definition right in front of him, and she had no idea anyone was watching. The glow from the laptop sharpened the edges of her focus, and for a few seconds the entire restaurant seemed to shrink around that single pool of light, as if everything expensive and polished had been reduced to a quiet stage for something far more real. And Ava leaned closer, her brow tightening slightly as rows of numbers shifted across the screen, her fingers pausing, then moving again with intention, not guessing, not hesitating, but correcting, refining, adjusting a discrepancy that no one had asked her to fix and no one had paid her to notice. And behind the column William Carter felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest, not discomfort, not yet, but a subtle disruption in the certainty he carried into rooms like this, because he had built his world on patterns, on predictable behavior, on the assumption that roles defined capability, and yet nothing about what he was seeing fit into that system. And Ava exhaled softly, almost like she had been holding her breath for hours, before whispering to herself, "That is not right," her voice low but steady, and she opened another file, cross-checking entries, tracing a chain of numbers that led to something deeper, something buried beneath layers of oversight and assumption. And the silence around her grew heavier, not empty but charged, like the moment before a realization takes shape. And William shifted slightly, careful not to reveal himself, his eyes fixed on the screen, He could not fully see, but somehow understood through her reactions, through the way her posture straightened when something clicked, through the small nod she gave herself when a correction aligned. And then she stopped, her fingers hovering above the keyboard as if the next move carried weight. And for a second she looked around the empty room, the instinct to remain unseen still guiding her. And then she reached for a receipt lying beside her, flipping it over and writing quickly, her handwriting neat but firm. Check Q3 vendor reconciliation. There is a mismatch in projected versus actual allocations, and she placed it carefully near the register again, not signing her name, not claiming ownership, just leaving the truth where someone might find it. And William felt that moment more than he expected, because it was not just what she had done, it was how she had done it, without announcement, without expectation, without the need to be recognized. And something about that unsettled him in a way that boardroom challenges never had. Because this was not competition. This was clarity, and clarity did not ask for permission. And Ava closed the laptop slowly, her reflection flickering across the dark screen before disappearing, and she returned it to her bag with the same quiet care, as if protecting something no one else had ever bothered to look for. And when she picked up the mop again, stepping back into the role the world had assigned her, William Carter finally understood that he had not been watching a waitress at all. He had been watching someone the system had failed to see. And for the first time that night, the most powerful man in the building did not feel in control of what happened next. The room did not change, not in any visible way. The chandeliers still hung like frozen light above polished tables. The city skyline still stretched beyond the glass like a promise of power. And yet something invisible had shifted, something subtle but undeniable, because William Carter did not step out. Immediately, he did not announce himself or interrupt the quiet rhythm Ava had returned to. Instead, he stayed where he was, watching her finish what she had started, watching the way she moved with the same quiet discipline as before, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened, as if correcting a mistake worth more than most people's annual salary was no different than wiping down a table. And that was what unsettled him the most. Not her intelligence, not even her precision, but her indifference to being seen. Because in his world, everything was built on visibility, on recognition, on the constant negotiation of status. And yet here she was, stepping back into invisibility by choice, not by force. And when she finally set the mop aside for the last time and reached for her bag, the sound of her zipper closing seemed louder than it should have been, sharp enough to break the silence that had held the room together. And that was when he moved, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the kind of presence that did not need volume to be felt. One step out of the shadows, then another, until the distance between them no longer belonged to darkness. And Ava froze, not out of fear but surprise, her hand still resting on the strap of her bag as she turned, her eyes meeting his for the first time, really meeting them. And for a brief second the roles the world had assigned them tried to reassert themselves. The billionaire and the waitress, the observer and the invisible. But something resisted that pattern, something in the way he looked at her now, not past her, not through her, but directly at her, as if recalculating everything he thought he understood. And he spoke, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that did not come from authority alone. "You missed a spot," he said, nodding slightly toward the far corner of the room. And the words hung there, not as criticism, but as a test. A familiar structure placed in an unfamiliar context, and Ava followed his gaze. For a second before looking back at him, her expression steady, unreadable in a way that suggested she was choosing her response rather than reacting to his presence. And then she said, quietly, "No, I did not." Not defensive, not confrontational, just certain, and the silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was no longer empty. It was active, like a line drawn between two people who were both aware that something had already changed. And William's eyes shifted slightly, a hint of something almost like recognition crossing his face, because that answer did not belong to someone who thought she was being evaluated. It belonged to someone who had already evaluated the situation herself. And he took another step closer, just enough to close the gap without crowding her, his voice lowering, not in secrecy but in precision. "Then what exactly were you fixing?" he asked, and this time it was not a test. It was a question, direct and unavoidable, and Ava did not look away, did not shrink or deflect. She simply held his gaze for a moment longer than most people in her position would have dared, and then she answered, "Something that was not my responsibility." And the way she said it made it clear that responsibility, to her, had never been defined by permission. And for the first time that night, William Carter did not feel like the one asking the questions. He felt like the one who had just been given an answer he did not yet know how to measure. The air between them did not break. It stretched, thin and precise, like a line drawn by two people who both understood that words now carried consequences beyond their sound. And William Carter held her gaze a moment longer, not to intimidate but to measure, as if recalibrating a system that had just returned unexpected data. And Ava did not shift under that attention. She did not look down, did not apologize for existing in a space that had never been designed for her to occupy in this way. She simply stood there, steady, grounded, her posture quiet but unyielding, and the contrast between them was no longer about status. It was about control of self, and for a brief second, that difference felt sharper than any title either of them carried. And William exhaled slowly, the kind of controlled breath that usually preceded a decision. But this time it came with something else, something less familiar. And he said, "You knew that was not your system." His voice even, not accusing, not approving, just stating a fact that hovered between them. And Ava nodded once, small but certain. "Yes," she answered, and there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to soften the truth. And he tilted his head slightly, studying her. "And you fixed it anyway." And again she nodded, her expression unchanged. "It was wrong," she said simply, and the simplicity of that answer landed heavier than any explanation could have, because it removed complexity from a world that depended on it. And William looked at her differently now, not as an employee, not as a variable in a system, but as someone operating outside of the logic he had spent years mastering. And for the first time in a long time, he asked a question without already knowing what answer he wanted to hear. "Do you always correct things that are not your responsibility?" And Ava's eyes flickered just slightly, not in uncertainty, but in thought, as if deciding how much of herself to reveal to someone who had not earned it. And then she said, "Only when no one else will." And the room seemed to absorb that sentence, the weight of it settling into the quiet corners, because it was not just an answer, it was a principle. One that did not ask for recognition. And William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, not in anger, but in realization. Because somewhere beneath the layers of structure and authority he had built, he recognized the gap she was pointing to, the space where responsibility had been delegated so far that accountability had disappeared. And he took another step, closing the distance just enough that the conversation no longer felt like an observation but an interaction. "What you found," he said, more carefully now. "It matters." And Ava's gaze did not change, but something in her stance shifted, not softer, not harder, just more aware. And she replied, "Then someone should look at it." And the words were not a request. They were a statement placed back into his hands. And for a moment, the power dynamic that had defined the room earlier that night felt almost irrelevant, because what stood between them now was not hierarchy but clarity. And William understood something in that instant that no report or board meeting had ever shown him. That value did not always come from where it was expected, and that the most important things in his world might be the ones happening where no one thought to look. And Ava adjusted the strap of her bag slightly, as if preparing to leave, not waiting for permission, not seeking approval, just moving forward. And William did not stop her, not yet, because for the first time that night, he was not trying to control the outcome. He was trying to understand it. And as she turned to walk away, the quiet echo of her footsteps carried something new through the room, something that had nothing to do with status and everything to do with truth. The sound of her footsteps did not rush, did not hesitate. It carried the same quiet certainty that had defined everything she had done that night. And Ava Johnson walked toward the service exit, as if nothing in that room had changed, as if the man standing behind her was still just another presence she did not need to adjust for. And yet behind her, William Carter did not move for a second longer than expected, his eyes following not her position but her pace, the way she did not look back, the way she did not wait. And something in that absence of reaction unsettled him more than defiance ever could, because he was used to responses, to shifts in behavior the moment people recognized who he was. But she had already seen him, already spoken to him, and still chose to leave the same way she would have if he had never stepped out of the shadows at all. And that was the moment he realized this was no longer about what she had done on that laptop. It was about who she was when no one was watching and who she remained even when someone powerful was. And he stepped forward then, not to reclaim control, but because letting her walk out without another word felt like ignoring something he had just been shown too clearly to dismiss. "Ava," he said, her name landing in the air with a precision that stopped her just short of the door, and she paused, not turning immediately, her hand resting lightly on the metal handle as if deciding whether this moment required her attention, and then she looked over her shoulder, her expression unchanged but her eyes sharper now, aware that this was no longer just an observation, but an interaction she could choose to continue or end, and William closed the distance. By a few measured steps, not invading, not commanding, just present. "Where did you learn to see things like that?" he asked, and the question was different from the ones before. It did not test her, it revealed something about him, about the fact that what he had witnessed did not fit into the structure he trusted, and Ava studied him for a second, long enough to recognize the shift, not just in his tone, but in his intent. And she answered without performance, by being the one who gets blamed when things go wrong. And there was no bitterness in her voice, just clarity, the kind that comes from experience repeated too many times to ignore, and William absorbed that answer in silence, because it exposed a pattern he had built his success around without ever having to stand inside it. And he nodded slowly, more to himself than to her. "And you never thought to bring this to someone," he continued, and Ava turned fully now, facing him with a steadiness that made the question feel smaller than it sounded. "People like me do not get invited into those conversations," she said, and the words were not defensive. They were factual, and they landed with a weight that did not need emphasis. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the truth she had just stated did not belong to a single situation, it belonged to a system. And William felt that recognition settle into him in a way that numbers and reports never had. And then he said something he did not often say, not in this tone, not without calculation. That might be a mistake. And Ava's expression did not change, but something in her gaze shifted slightly. Not hope, not expectation, just acknowledgement. And she replied, "It usually is." And the simplicity of that exchange carried more meaning than either of them needed to explain. And the space between them no longer felt defined by hierarchy, but by something else, something quieter and far more difficult to ignore. And Ava reached for the door again, her fingers wrapping around the handle. And this time when she opened it, the cool night air slipped into the room, brushing past them both, and she stepped through without looking back, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt empty, but filled with a question William Carter could not walk away from. Because for the first time in a long time, he had seen something in his world that did not belong to him, and he did not yet know what to do with it. The door closed behind her with a soft metallic click, and the sound lingered longer than it should have, echoing faintly through the empty restaurant as if the room itself was marking the moment. And William Carter stood where he was, unmoving, his eyes still fixed on the space she had just occupied, not because he expected her to return, but because something about her absence now felt more present than anything else in the room. And for a man who measured outcomes in numbers and timelines, this feeling did not fit into any category he trusted, and yet it refused to be ignored. And slowly, almost instinctively, he turned back toward the table where Ava had worked, his steps quieter now, less deliberate, as if the certainty he carried into the night had been replaced by something more careful. And when he reached the register, his eyes found the receipt she had left behind, the ink still fresh enough to suggest intention, not impulse. And he picked it up, holding it between his fingers as if it carried more than just a note, as if it carried proof of something he had missed. And he read the words once, then again. Check Q3 vendor reconciliation. There is a mismatch in projected versus actual allocations. And the sentence was simple, almost understated, but it struck him with a precision that no executive summary ever had, because it did not try to impress, it did not try to explain, it simply pointed to a truth that had been overlooked. And William's jaw tightened slightly, not in frustration but in recognition, because he knew exactly how many layers a discrepancy like that would have passed through, how many people would have seen. pieces of it without seeing the whole, and yet she had, standing alone, unpaid for that insight, uninvited to that level of responsibility, and still she had chosen to act, and he folded the receipt carefully, slipping it into the inside pocket of his jacket, not as a habit, but as a decision, and then he reached for his phone, the screen lighting up against the dim room as he dialed a number. He rarely used it this hour, and when the line connected, his voice was calm but different, sharper in a way that suggested this was not a routine call. "I need a full audit on Q3 vendor allocations," he said, his tone leaving no room for delay, and there was a pause on the other end, a hesitation that would have annoyed him any other night. But now it only confirmed what he already suspected, and he continued before they could respond, "Not tomorrow, tonight." And when the call ended, the silence returned, but it no longer felt passive, it felt active, like something had been set in motion, and William glanced once more around the room. The same polished surfaces, the same quiet luxury, but none of it looked quite the same anymore, because now he knew that somewhere within all of this order, there had been a flaw, one that had gone unnoticed until someone who was never meant to see it had done exactly that, and he exhaled slowly, adjusting his jacket as if preparing for something larger than a late-night decision. And for the first time that night, his next move was not about control, it was about correction, and somewhere outside, beyond the glass and steel and carefully maintained appearances, Ava Johnson was already gone, walking into a world that still expected nothing from her, unaware that inside, the man who had once overlooked people like her was now rewriting decisions because of her, and that shift, quiet and unseen, had already begun to change everything. By the time the first light of morning began to slip through the glass towers of the city, the silence of the night had been replaced by something far more structured, the low hum of systems coming back online, emails firing across departments, analysts being pulled into early calls they did not expect, and inside his office, 20 floors above the street, William Carter stood looking at a wall of data that no longer felt abstract, because now every number carried context, every column hinted at the gap Ava had pointed to with nothing more than a pen and a receipt, and the audit results had come in faster than usual, not because the system had changed overnight, but because his attention had, and what it revealed was not chaos, not fraud in the dramatic sense, but something quieter and far more dangerous, layers of small misalignments, overlooked adjustments, decisions made without full visibility, each one insignificant on its own, but together forming a pattern that cost more than anyone had bothered to calculate. And William's eyes moved across the screen slowly, not searching, but confirming, because he already knew where to look, and behind him, his senior analyst stood waiting, uncertain, holding a tablet filled with explanations that suddenly felt less convincing. "It appears to be a reporting delay issue," the analyst began carefully, choosing words that had worked in other situations, but William did not acknowledge the explanation immediately, because for the first time, he was not interested in how the problem was being framed, he was interested in why it had not been seen sooner. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm but stripped of the usual tolerance for polished answers. "How long has this been there?" And the analyst hesitated, just slightly, long enough to reveal the truth behind the uncertainty. "Possibly 2 quarters, he admitted, and the number settled into the room with a weight that did not need emphasis, because it meant that dozens of eyes had passed over it, dozens of opportunities to notice, to question, to correct, and yet it had taken someone outside that entire structure to see it clearly. And William turned then, his gaze direct, not harsh but precise, and no one flagged it, he said, not as a question, but as a statement that required acknowledgement, and the analyst lowered his eyes briefly. "No, sir." And in that moment, the hierarchy that usually defined the room felt secondary to something else, something that had nothing to do with titles and everything to do with awareness. And William nodded once, not in approval, but in understanding, because the problem was no longer just the numbers. It was the system that had allowed them to go unnoticed, and his thoughts shifted, not back to the data, but to the quiet figure in a dim restaurant, to the way she had seen what others had missed without being asked, without being expected to, and that contrast sharpened his next decision. "I want a list of everyone who had access to these reports," he said, his tone steady, and then after a brief pause, he added something that caught even himself off guard. And I want to know who we are not listening to. And the analyst blinked, unsure how to respond to a request that did not fit into any standard process. But William did not clarify, because he already knew what he meant. And as the room shifted into motion, phones lighting up, messages being sent, he stepped back slightly, his reflection appearing faintly in the glass behind him, and for a brief second, he saw not just the man who controlled outcomes, but the man who had almost missed something that mattered. And somewhere across the city, in a small apartment that did not appear on any corporate map, Ava Johnson was starting her day the same way she always did, without knowing that the line she had written on a receipt had just reached a place it was never meant to go, and that the man who once measured value and visibility was now questioning everything he thought he understood about where it truly lived. The city moved on as it always did, indifferent to quiet shifts that did not announce themselves, traffic filling the streets, morning light reflecting off glass towers, and inside the restaurant. Nothing looked different at first glance. The same polished floors, the same carefully arranged tables, the same expectation that everything would run exactly as it had the night before. And Ava Johnson stepped through the service entrance with the same measured pace, her uniform pressed, her expression calm, carrying with her the weight of another day that did not promise anything beyond what she had already learned to handle. And no one greeted her differently. No one paused or looked twice. Because as far as the world inside that building was concerned, she was still exactly who she had been yesterday. And she moved through her routine without hesitation, checking supplies, tying her apron, stepping into the rhythm of work that did not require recognition to be done well. And yet, somewhere beyond that space, decisions were unfolding that would never normally reach her world. And in a conference room high above, William Carter sat at the head of a long table, the audit results now printed, highlighted, no longer just data on a screen but evidence laid out in a way that demanded accountability. And the room was filled with people who had built their careers on precision, on control, on the assumption that nothing significant escaped their oversight. And yet the silence that settled over them now suggested otherwise. And William did not raise his voice, did not accuse or point, because this was not about assigning blame in the way they were used to. It was about exposing a blind spot they had all shared. And he placed the folded receipt on the table, smoothing it out with deliberate care, the simple handwritten note standing in contrast to the polished reports surrounding it. And for a moment no one spoke, because the implication was clear without explanation. And one of the executives finally leaned forward, confusion flickering across his face. "Where did this come from?" he asked, and William looked at the paper, then at the room, and answered in a tone that carried more weight than the question itself. "From someone we did not think to ask." And the words shifted the air in a way no presentation ever could, because they pointed not just to a mistake, but to a pattern of omission. And across the table, eyes lowered, not in guilt alone, but in recognition of something deeper. And William continued, not to criticize, but to redefine the expectation. "We are not missing information," he said. "We are missing perspective." And that distinction settled into the room with a clarity that left little room for defense. And far below, unaware of any of this, Ava moved between tables, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, her presence blending into the background as it always had. And yet something had already begun to change, not in how she worked, but in how her actions were being understood elsewhere. And back upstairs, William stood, the meeting shifting with him, not because he demanded it, but because his focus had moved beyond the problem itself. "Find her," he said simply, and the request was not loud, not dramatic, but it carried a precision that left no doubt about its importance. And for the first time in that room, the most valuable person in the story was not sitting at the table, not presenting data, not holding a title, but walking quietly across a restaurant floor, unaware that the space she had always been invisible in had just become the center of a decision that would bring her into view. They found her faster than anyone expected, not because she stood out, but because once someone finally decided to look, her presence had always been there, consistent, precise, impossible to miss if you knew what to look for. And by mid-afternoon, the manager approached her near the service station, his tone unusually careful, as if delivering a message he did not fully understand. "Ava, there is someone who wants to speak with you." And she paused, her hand resting lightly on a tray of glasses. Her expression calm but attentive, because requests like that rarely came without consequence, and she followed him through the restaurant, past the table she had reset countless times, into a private dining room that felt unchanged and yet entirely different. And when the door opened, William Carter was already there, standing near the window, the city stretching behind him like a backdrop that no longer defined the moment. And Ava stepped inside without hesitation, her posture steady, her eyes meeting his with the same quiet composure as the night before, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke, because what had brought them here did not need to be repeated. It had already been understood, and William moved first, not with authority, but with intention, placing the same receipt on the table between them, now unfolded, no longer hidden in his pocket, but presented as something that mattered. "You were right," he said, and the words were simple, direct, stripped of everything unnecessary. And Ava glanced at the paper briefly, then back at him, her expression unchanged, because being right had never been the point. And he continued, his voice steady but carrying something deeper now. "It has been there for months," and there was no defensiveness in his tone, only acknowledgement, and Ava nodded once, not in validation, but in recognition of a truth that had already existed before either of them spoke about it. And the silence that followed was not empty, it was complete, as if the first part of something had just reached its natural conclusion. And William took a step closer, not to close distance, but to shift the conversation. "I asked my entire team how they missed it," he said, "but that was the wrong question." And Ava's gaze held his, steady, waiting, not for permission, but for clarity, and he continued, "The real question is why you saw it." And for the first time, there was something in his voice that did not come from control, something closer to respect, and Ava considered that for a moment, not because she did not have an answer, but because she understood the weight behind the question, and then she said, "Because I was not looking for approval," and the words settled between them with a quiet finality, and William nodded slowly, absorbing it, because it explained more than any report ever could, and in that moment, the imbalance that had defined their roles shifted again, not erased, but redefined, and he reached into his jacket, pulling out a card, placing it on the table beside the receipt, not sliding it toward her, not presenting it as an offer to be accepted or rejected in a single moment, but as an extension of something that had already begun. "If you are willing," he said, "I would like you to be in the room next time we look at this." And Ava's eyes moved briefly to the card, then back to him, her expression still composed, still grounded, but now carrying something new, not surprise, not hesitation, but awareness of a choice that had never been offered to her before. And she did not reach for the card immediately, because for the first time, the decision was not being made for her, and the room held that moment quietly, without pressure, without expectation, as two people who had met on opposite ends of a system stood facing something neither of them had planned. And somewhere beneath the surface of that exchange, something irreversible had already happened, because he had seen her, and she had never needed to be seen to know her value. And that difference was what made this moment matter.